welcome you here to Rotary today. We're appreciative of Nebo School District for allowing us to use their facilities today. Thank you, Lana, for setting that up. So Dr. Jay Jacobson and I go way back. He doesn't remember me, but I remember him because he taught my virology class when I was in medical school. And so when I was up at my medical school reunion, I saw Dr. Scott Leckman, who's the district president, and asked him whom I could get to speak for us today, and he suggested that I contact Dr. Jacobson. So Dr. Jacobson is a professor emeritus of internal medicine and infectious disease from the University of Utah. He's the founding chief of the Division of Medical Ethics and Humanities at LDS Hospital and University of Utah School of Medicine. He did his medical school at the University of Florida, and then he went to the Center for Disease Control, and then came to the University of Utah to do his fellowship. And you were also at the University of Chicago, and then has been on the faculty until he retired. But retirement doesn't mean stopping. He's still very active in what he does. He has authored over 100 articles, book chapters, and the book called The Patient as Victim and Vector, Ethics in Infectious Diseases. And then he's been involved in multiple other things. He gave me a short bio just to say that he works hard and is a great asset. He didn't say that, but he does work hard and is a great asset to the state of Utah and particularly to the University of Utah. So we'll turn the time over to him. We can't get many more eminent experts in the field of virology than Dr. Jacobson, so we're happy to have him here to present this topic on polio. Dr. Jacobson.
Thank you, Tracy. It's really lovely to be here. I was going to tell you that my principal goal today is to make sure that everybody knows exactly how close we are to eradicating polio in the world, and then to encourage you to do your part to make that possible. And you just made my job so much easier. If you think about it, with 1.2 million Rotarians in the world, if every one of them contributed $50, isn't that about $60 million? That's really amazing. What you want to know is if we contribute $50 million, that will be matched now 2-to-1 by really generous philanthropy foundations like the Gates Foundation, also funded by the Buffett family, right? So you're there. You are this close, which is how close we are to eradicating polio. And I really mean that. It's one thing to start out with a group of people that may be skeptical, unfamiliar, and uninvolved with polio eradication and try to make the case that they should be knowledgeable about it and be engaged and a part of the solution to that problem. That's a very different feeling than learning that you've just been at a high school, which, by the way, is where you find uninformed and unengaged, right? But you literally touch them. Something like a Purple Pinky project, it's actually really hands-on, right? It's literally fingers on. But you got them aware. And I don't know about you, but that seems very meaningful to me, to have a group of young people actually dig into their pocket and make a connection between what they're doing and what they may be doing, in this case, far away in another part of the world. There's no way that they view that as something that's immediately beneficial to them. I think I'm safe saying that. I don't think high school students in Utah have ever seen a case of polio. So you've done a wonderful job. It's sort of like my job, helping them understand that. Lana?
We have an administrator actually that had polio, so our kids have seen that firsthand.
So Pete reminded me earlier that if you're watching this on tape, you wouldn't have heard that Lana let me know that there's an administrator in her program who is personally a victim of polio. And I think that's the way many of us as adults now understand that disease. We actually know someone who typically is going to be older than 40 or even 50 years old, and they either had polio as a child and knew it, or they may have something called the post-polio syndrome, which we often overlook, but often affects older individuals. So I think that's a really nice personal connection to mention, and I appreciate that. And sometimes I think knowing people makes this disease so much more real than anything that I could tell you about, even when I mention things like millions of cases that once occurred in the world. That's very dramatic as a number, but it's not as powerful as knowing an individual. So thanks, Lena, for that. So I hope some of you recognize some of the images in this particular slide. If not, it'll be obvious immediately. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt contracted polio at his summer home at Campobello in 1921. He was a young student athlete at that time. His legs were permanently paralyzed. 17 years later, in 1938, as President of the United States, Roosevelt helped create the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which was later renamed the March of Dimes Foundation, in order to study polio and support its victims. Polio continued to paralyze thousands of children and young adults in the United States every year. That was true in the year that he was affected, was every year after that, and it continued during his presidency. So the March of Dimes was designed to investigate polio, the cause of which wasn't immediately apparent. People did realize that it was a communicable disease, and many parents spent the summers really anxious about their children, some sending them away to camp to be away from big cities, others telling them to avoid puddles and swimming pools. A lot of mythology around polio and how it was contracted. So Roosevelt's contribution early on was to help support the foundation that was leading a research effort. In the years following the Second World War, the only thing that Americans feared more than polio was nuclear war. So on the minds of all parents, people who are old enough to remember worrying about the bomb and duck and cover in school should also be old enough to remember that their parents were extremely worried about a threat that was not only real, but much closer to home. The bomb never fell in the continental United States, but polio was a part of every summer's experience for families. So the March of Dimes, which was run by Roosevelt's former law partner, his name was Basil O'Connor, was raising more than $20 million a year by the late 1940s. So we talked earlier about raising $50 million from 1 million people around the world in the 21st century. I'm sure you can appreciate what $20 million a year meant shortly after World War II. So you're looking at a huge effort that an enormous number of people contributed to. Some of you may remember, I do, even on Halloween, collecting money for the March of Dimes. So children, high school students, adults, all over the United States, again, remember what a threat this was. Were digging into their pockets, often giving small amounts that amounted to $20 million a year. While most scientists believe that effective vaccines could only be developed with live viruses, Jonas Salk developed what was called a killed virus vaccine. So up until that time, our successes were probably largest with something like smallpox, which is prevented by a live attenuated vaccine. So researchers and scientists believe that the only way to prevent another viral disease, polio, was to do the same thing. That's very challenging, right? First, you're working with a live virus, in theory attenuated, which means modified or mitigated in some ways. The challenges are that people in the laboratory are working with a live virus that produces polio or another viral disease. And when one attempts to attenuate it, you may be successful. You might actually magnify it. I mean, as you're adjusting the genetic sequence of a virus, not always immediately clear what that intervention will produce. So the risk of working with live viruses, even after they're modified, is significant. Salk had the other view, that he could achieve immunity by using a virus that was killed. right? So safer on both ends. In the laboratory, those fortunate enough to work with the virus that had already been killed are not at risk, and people receiving a killed virus not really at risk of developing an acute infection. Again, the mystery, the challenge was, could those receiving the killed virus mount a significant and sustained immune response? So that was Salk's idea, not widely shared. Many researchers, including Albert Sabin, that name may strike a chord, I'll explain it in a little bit, who was developing an oral live virus polio vaccine, called Salk's approach dangerous. He even belittled Salk and called him a mere kitchen chemist. Okay, so early days in terms of people insulting each other. I think that would be pretty gentle by contemporary standards, but a mere kitchen chemist. Remember Basil O'Connor, the law partner? So he was pretty impatient at the time-consuming process of developing a live virus vaccine, and he put the resources of the March of Dimes behind Salk. So those resources, $20 million a year. So this is an incredible story about a very hard problem, and in fact, the less attractive solution to a hard problem being very generously funded. After inoculating and protecting many monkeys, Salk began the risky step of testing his vaccine on humans. And in 1952, and again, I'm looking at a couple of you because that's not a year that we'd find recall for in a high school population, and not in all Rotary clubs either, right? So 1952, he vaccinated children at 2 Pittsburgh institutions, and he injected himself, his wife, and his 3 sons, where? In his kitchen. After boiling the needles and syringes on his stovetop, he announced the success of those initial human tests to a national radio audience on March 26, 1953. So we're just now post-World War II, a lot of funding, about 8 years after the war. The trial is done, and it's very successful. In 1954, in an unprecedented national trial after that early Pittsburgh success, 1.8 million people, including hundreds of thousands of school children, were vaccinated. Anyone here that has a personal memory of that? So you have one. I'm just looking at one Rotarian that remembers. This was a countrywide effort. I'll just share with you that Utah was actually very early in this effort. There was a lot of publicity in Utah, a lot of children in Utah, a lot of concerned parents in Utah, and a lot of aware parents. So I think acceptance of this vaccine was still pretty early, very, very new in terms of what we know about products, side effects, and again, you can contrast that with the 21st century, where I think a lot of parents are pretty skeptical about vaccines. It was a very new vaccine, widely accepted, and in fact, almost demanded. People were lining up early in the morning for vaccine clinics that often vaccinated thousands of children within the space of a day. By the way, that was the first double-blind trial ever conducted in the United States. Tracy knows the significance of that. That's actually the standard that we use for research today. It actually means testing a live or killed but active vaccine against a placebo, right? And a double-blind trial means neither the investigators nor the recipients know which vaccine they're getting. So once again, when you think about the enthusiasm for this vaccine, for the trials at least, parents didn't have any guarantee that their child would be getting the active vaccine and not the placebo. But they were so eager to take any chance at protection that literally, if you believe this was a very effective vaccine, the most you could expect would be a 50% likelihood. Right after the trials were over, it was understood that all children would be vaccinated. So long term, there's protection coming. But at the front end, I would say not only is it the first double-blind trial, it's probably the most enthusiastically embraced research project ever conducted in the United States. So it's an incredible story. Remember Sabin calling Salk the mere kitchen chemist? He argued, as this trial was going on, that it would cause more cases of polio than it would prevent. So very much from sort of a person of stature and respect, a very dark prediction about this vaccine. That, in fact, didn't happen as a result of the trials per se. But we can talk a little bit later with questions and answers about the risks of different polio vaccines, because it is the case that there can be both adverse reactions to vaccines and actually with some even cases of what are called vaccine-acquired polio. So complicated question. In 1955, we're a year later, and that on the same day that the Salk vaccine was declared by the Food and Drug Administration safe, effective, and potent, a CBS newsman, whose name again would be familiar to only some of you, Edward R. Murrow. Some of you may know that from a remarkable documentary about his career, which even included interviews with Senator McCarthy about the McCarthy hearings, which are very contemporary with this event. So this is a time of kind of national debate, suspicion, including suspicion of some researchers. Again, maybe a familiar theme. But Edward R. Murrow, very distinguished, asked Salk who owned the patent for the polio vaccine. And Salk responded, well, the people, I would say, in light of the millions of charitable donations raised by the March of Dimes that funded our research and field testing. There is no patent. Could somebody patent the sun? So that was Salk's answer. And again, I think a really important thing to think about, even at the present, that is, we're challenged by eliminating this disease in the world, but we're working with very inexpensive vaccines. We're really very, very fortunate to be in that position. I don't know if some of you have inquired about the cost of the new Shingles vaccine. Tracy knows about this. Something like $700 for 2 doses of vaccine. There's just no way you could contemplate every year vaccinating millions of children to prevent a disease if that were the cost. So Salk's answer, could you patent the sun? It turned out lawyers for the foundation actually had considered patenting the vaccine, but they didn't because of Salk's reluctance. So again, a couple of things to think about. This person sort of working uphill in his kitchen against objections of some of his peers and rejecting the idea of kind of personal enrichment over a product that people were clamoring to use, right? I mean, there's little question about what the demand would be. So I think that's a really great part of this story. I don't know if Salk was a Rotarian, but it wouldn't surprise you, right? Okay. So in 1957, after he developed the polio vaccine, Salk began his quest to fulfill a second dream. And 6 years after that, he established the Salk Institute, which is in La Jolla in California. It's an institute that continues to work on really challenging questions, often related to viruses or genetics now. And of course, he is not the physically active leader, but that institute continues his own quest to find kind of creative, maybe not so popular answers, but safe and effective answers to very hard questions. So his pledge was, we cannot be certain what will happen here, but we can be certain it will contribute to the welfare and understanding of man. So how did all of this wrap up in terms of Salk's lifetime? Well, remember Sabin? So while Salk developed this first injectable killed virus vaccine, Sabin took longer, but did develop an oral live virus polio vaccine, and that has eventually supplanted Salk's. But that live virus vaccine, I told you I'd mentioned this earlier, is actually responsible for about a dozen cases of polio every year. So you want to think about that, and we can handle this with more questions. But here's a live virus being administered to a child. It's in the child's system and is excreted in the child's stool. If the stool contaminates water that other people consume, someone else may be exposed to an attenuated but live polio virus. For most people, that actually results in immunization. It's actually kind of a side benefit of a live virus vaccine. Children in the immediate environment of an infant shedding live virus polio vaccine are actually immunized. So when you immunize one child with a live virus vaccine, you may be immunizing more than one. If water is contaminated and consumed by tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of children, it's actually quite plausible that one of those children does not have a fully functional immune system. So instead of responding as almost all individuals do to an attenuated vaccine strain, they may actually develop polio, right? They're without the ability to mount the antibody response that most healthy youngsters are capable of. So oddly and paradoxically, it's the Sabin vaccine, the vaccine developed by the person who accused his competitor of developing a vaccine that might cause more disease than it prevented, which actually does that. So things to remember about that are, it's complicated. It's a vaccine that's cheap and effective and very easy to administer. Giving drops of an oral vaccine, especially on a sugar cube, as some of you may have encountered it, is much easier than holding a child, particularly a toddler, still for an injection. So easier to give and many more benefits, right? It's actually effectively immunizing a group of kids for every single kid that you immunize. So there was a reason, and we can sort of go a little deeper about why, but there was an argument for knowingly using that vaccine. What I've told you is not a surprise to the people who made that choice. It's a very pragmatic decision. However, I've told you that it causes about a dozen cases of polio each year, and that vaccine is actually the final obstacle to eliminating the disease. As soon as we are successful at seeing the last case of wild-type polio, we may still continue to see vaccine-derived strains causing polio in a very small number of children. So what are we going to do? Well, the World Health Organization has urged polio-free countries to return to Salk's killed virus vaccine. So that's kind of the end of this story, and that's exactly what we're going to do around the world. As we get to the point where we're calling polio eradicated, and you remember how many countries we're talking about now? 2, principally, Afghanistan and Pakistan. As soon as we declare them polio-free, meaning free of wild virus polio, we will switch back over to the killed virus vaccine that was the beginning of this story. So it's a remarkable story, and it involves significant individuals, leadership, and champions, and contributors. And that's exactly what it's going to take to finish it. And the story about Rotary and polio is absolutely as important as President Roosevelt. So as this disease was continuing in the rest of the world, when it was essentially eradicated in the United States, Rotary recognized a problem in the Philippines and sponsored a huge polio immunization campaign. Hundreds of thousands of children. And polio was eliminated from the Philippines. So I mean, it's just this incredible, first of all, the Philippines are an island. In many ways, the United States is an island. So by eliminating the disease here, we achieved something and could sort of tie the ribbon on the package and say we're done, except for the fact that people come and go from our big island, right? So as long as people from anywhere in the world are coming to the United States, if we were to stop vaccinating, we would start to see polio again in our country. A good example of that, if that sounds implausible, is a huge measles epidemic, which occurred in the United States only 3 years ago. when visitors came to Disneyland, mingled with thousands of kids from all over the US who were not immunized, and the kids went home, including to Utah, and we began to see cases of measles, a disease we also thought was eradicated in the United States. So obviously, exactly the same possibility exists for polio, and that was the reason, in part, that Rotary went to the Philippines. It did several things, just like that large trial. It proved that in a developing country, with enough effort, and again, Rotary is a secret, right? Putting so many boots on the ground, so many people that were local who knew where to go and what to do, along with Americans and people from all over the world in Rotary, they actually got vaccine to enough children that year and in subsequent years that within several years there were not wild cases of polio in the Philippines. Well, that's an incredible example, and that's one of the examples that led the rest of the world to think we could do this. And what was their motivation? Well, even for countries like the US, which had seen the last cases of wild polio, they realized that there was no choice but to keep giving polio to every new child constantly until the disease was eliminated from the world. And the exciting thing would be, once it was eliminated from the world, that would be over. So it's unlike many service projects in Rotary. We were just talking about the dictionary project. Well, until third graders are born knowing everything in the dictionary, I think it may be helpful to give them a book, sometimes the first book of their own. And I expect that projects like that will continue indefinitely. And they should, right? Because that addresses a continuing problem. But isn't it exciting to think about an enormous problem in the world that can actually be finished and put to bed? And that's actually the story of Rotary's involvement in polio. And again, not alone. The partners are the ones that you would expect: the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, and much more recently, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has that sort of shared goal of making everyone in the world safer and healthier. So we have excellent partners, and everybody is sort of ramping up this effort at the end. And the challenge of the effort at the end is it doesn't sound like a very big deal. I mean, once it was the case that this disease was endemic in every single country, including our own. Now we stand here seemingly comfortable saying, as we just did, there are only 2 countries left in the world. Like, how big a deal is that? And when I tell you that from hundreds of thousands of cases of polio every year, we are now seeing less than 25 cases of polio in the world, it really sounds like it's very small. And in reality, it is. It's so much smaller than it was. But remember what I said about measles. It may be small, but if we stop vaccinating anywhere, the problem can return, and there's no reason it couldn't return in the same magnitude. Yet if you have millions of vulnerable children in the world and the disease is back, you will see millions of cases of polio. So even though the numbers are small, the importance is the same. If we don't finish the problem, it will only get worse. It's exactly what will happen. So then people wonder, why is it so difficult to finish the problem? How about this? Why is it so expensive? And the reason for that is that while the disease is not eradicated, all the efforts to immunize children all over the world, including developing countries, continues. We were successful, remarkably successful in India in eradicating polio several years ago. But if that's going to continue to be true, remember that India shares a border with Pakistan. If it's going to be continually true that Indian children are protected against polio, it actually means immunizing millions of children in India every year. Are you with me? So that has to happen. It's very expensive to vaccinate millions of people far away. It involves incredible logistics. It involves refrigerating and delivering vaccine. It involves doing publicity to make people come out with their children. It means knocking on doors of parents who haven't brought their children to be vaccinated. And it means long conversations with parents who are doubtful or skeptical about the vaccine. And the countries that are left are two Muslim countries. Both of them have been hearing stories about how dangerous this vaccine is. They're both aware of something that our country participated in order to track down and kill Osama bin Laden. They used a public health clinic, a vaccine clinic, to get information that would lead them to Osama bin Laden. The communities around the world are aware of that subterfuge, and it's made them dubious and cynical about the US particularly leading an effort to vaccinate. We can talk in a bit, if you like, about what the world has done to address that very worrisome kind of misinformed objection to polio vaccine. What I want to say to you is it's very expensive to deal with that. It's also very risky. Sadly, there are examples of people involved in polio immunization campaigns, both directly involved with polio, but also the Red Cross, that have been killed in an effort to deliver this kind of preventive health and preventive medicine to their population. So add security as an extra cost. So very expensive to get the end of this job accomplished, but incredibly valuable if it happens. Because if you're the person who does finances, the way you would look at this would be what's the cost of the investment and what's the return. Once this is done, think of what is saved first by not immunizing millions of children in every country in the world. In 200 countries, that will stop. Then think about the costs that are saved by children not being ruined and crippled by an infectious disease that may leave them paralyzed, especially in a country where a paralyzed child has almost no opportunity to get gainful employment. We talked a little bit earlier about Lana telling us that she knows someone who had polio as a child. In India, and certainly in Pakistan and Afghanistan, you have no trouble seeing people who had polio as a child. They are the beggars. They're the people hauling themselves along the street by their hands with legs that don't work. So try to think about what that would mean economically to put an end to that kind of disability. So it's an exciting project. You're probably better informed. I can't be sure of that yet, but you're certainly more engaged. Using your foundation, using expected giving, and particularly using your outreach to the high school. I have to tell you, with over 45 clubs in Utah, you are among the leadership. That's not happening in every single club. So you really want to feel good about that. And if we're as successful as we hope to be, you want to claim credit for that. You will be a part of the solution. People that are not engaged in this, in some ways, are part of the problem. Wouldn't it be a tragedy if this actually fails and we see a resurgence of polio because we were $2 million short 1 year? I mean, that would really be embarrassing. So you're on the right side. We'll just go over these as soon as I state them. Be able to explain what polio is. I think I've kind of hinted at that, but maybe not fully defined it. I think you are already aware of how international institutions and RI have just about managed to eradicate this. I think we've covered that. Hard and expensive, I tried to do that. You may have more questions about that. I'd be glad to answer them. Particularly, I could answer if you want to know, what is your money going to Rotary Polio Plus doing? What is the role of those dollars in this campaign as compared to maybe some other contributors or other partners? But I think you're on board. I think you probably already realize that if we stop support too soon, epidemics will absolutely recur. And the last one is where you are to start with: informed, able, willing, and ready to finish the most important, significant project that I think Rotary, or frankly, any service organization has ever undertaken. So it's really exciting. So the only one I see that might even be a little confusing would be being able to explain what polio is. Does that seem like a challenge to any of you? Would one of you be comfortable just saying, if someone asked you what's polio, what would you say? The designated hitter right in front of me. Tracy, what would you say?
I would
would say it's a viral disease that is able to go from person to person, communicable, that has the ability to change lives for the worse.
So again, if you're listening and you didn't hear Tracy, everything he said were correct little bullet points. It is a viral disease. It is communicable from person to person, and it could be life-changing and life-damaging in the individuals affected. I'm going to just modify that a little bit and fill in some gaps that may be helpful. So absolutely, it's a viral disease. Remember that theme, live virus, kill viruses, so it's absolutely a virus. There are actually 3 particular types of this polio virus. They're all included in the live vaccine product. We're not seeing wild disease to 2 of those any longer. So one of the first modifications we'll make is limiting the vaccine, the live oral polio vaccine, to the 1 strain, right? And then we'll stop seeing virus-derived cases of polio due to the attenuated strains that are in the oral vaccine currently. So that's already underway. So 2 of the 3 literally have been eliminated. So the wild cases we're seeing are only due to 1, and we'll match that with the oral vaccine. That's the viral story. The next one is it's communicable from person to person. So we had to learn all this about AIDS relatively recently in the 80s, right? With a new viral disease, people were quite afraid even to be in the same room as somebody with HIV or AIDS, right? Remember, policemen who were just standing by as people were marching were wearing masks, sometimes white spacesuit-like garments. There are diseases that are transmitted through the air. HIV/AIDS is not one of them, and neither is polio. So this disease is transmitted, and I alluded to that, by what physicians call fecal-oral spread. So because it passes through the system and into our GI tract, virus is excreted in stool. So people who live in crowded households without proper hygiene, right, can easily spread those vaccine strains within the home. The same thing was true of polio. So in a neighborhood with insufficient water and soap, 1 child infected with polio could easily infect 2 or 3 other children or young adults if they had not been immune. So the disease is spread by the fecal-oral route. How do we stop that? Well, vaccinating children would certainly be one way, so even if they ingest virus, they're protected. The other one is to try to improve sanitation. So even though I haven't alluded to that, at the same time that people are working so hard on this polio vaccination campaign, they're actually also working hard to clean up water supplies, right? Because that's actually another way the disease is transmitted, either wild virus or vaccine derived. That's actually another cost for cleaning up this last remnant of the epidemic. So I don't think I used the word surveillance before, but a very big part of this effort is continuing to take water samples from community water sources in the developing world to identify which water sources may actually be sources of live or vaccine-derived strains. And if that's recognized, either prohibiting use of that water, which means developing alternatives, or treating that water supply, which can be very expensive, to make sure that it's non-infectious. So communicable disease, person to person, fecal, oral, and I think that gives you enough to kind of get a grasp on what could be done. The last one is about it infects people and it can transform their lives. This is something maybe not well appreciated, and if there's something that you learned today, I'm guessing this might be it. This is actually a harder disease to eliminate than smallpox, which we did eliminate. We eliminated while I was at the CDC a year before I came to Utah and got involved in teaching, as Tracy remembers. In the case of smallpox, everyone who is infected is sick, and everyone who is sick has multiple lesions that we call pox, right? So if you've ever seen chicken pox, you can begin to imagine smallpox, sicker patient, many more lesions, bigger lesions, some sort of swollen and tender. But that's easy to see. So if you're trying to eliminate smallpox, and it's mostly gone the way polio is now, what you do is step back and wait for a case of smallpox to appear in the village. And you will know it's the first case because every case is sick, every case has a rash. What you do about that is called ring isolation. You just stop people from leaving the village. You rush in and immunize everybody close to the person who is ill, and you wait. There's a fixed incubation period, less than a week. If someone has been exposed and infected, they too will be sick and apparent within that time. You support them, no treatment for smallpox, and you keep the walls up around the village. After the incubation period, no one else is getting ill. Everyone else has either been vaccinated or they were previously immune. We're done. You lift the walls on that village, and you have just prevented the transmission of smallpox in that community. What did you need to do that? You needed 100% clinical attack rate. You needed a virus that makes every person obvious to be a case. Now let's talk about polio. Polio, remember, fecal oral? That's actually a gastrointestinal disease. For many young, healthy people, including children who ingest the polio virus, many will be non-ill entirely. They will have no clinical manifestations, but they will mount an antibody response. So they will never have been clinically ill, never recognized, but thereafter protected. That explains a lot of kids with polio. The next group of people will be ill. They will have diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, and they will be indistinguishable from diarrhea, nausea, and vomiting, which is a very common problem among infants. There's nothing apparent about that. If you had an effective laboratory, you might be able to discern which of those children had polio and which had rotavirus or norovirus, right? But they don't have those laboratories in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So that's quite a problem. It's less than 1 in 100 of children who get polio who become paralyzed. And not all of them remain irreversibly paralyzed. So the people that you know or may know who have reached adulthood as paralyzed individuals from polio are among one of the rarest events that happens with polio infection. And the reason that we see so many of them in countries like India and Pakistan is because so many hundreds of thousands of people have been infected with this virus. So that even though the attack rate for paralytic polio is low, with 1 million people affected, it would not be surprising to find 1,000 or 5,000 people who are paralyzed. You with me? So do you see why that's a problem? In smallpox, you know where the cases are, and you can apply local measures. Polio, for the most part, is invisible. And if we see a case of paralysis in a child in Afghanistan, it probably means there were 100 or more children infected that we didn't see. We don't know where they live. So with that point, I think I'll stop and say, you've met these objectives. To your credit, you met a few of them before I got here. But I think my real objective is motivational. So you're a remarkable group. You know more about this problem than many others. You know how close we are. I think the challenge for you might be to get the message out. That is, to get people even beyond your Rotary Club to think about a disease they may have forgotten about and just help you. By the way, you know you have, the foundation is like the #1 rated charity in the world. So if people say, you know, I'm a little dubious about spending money there, tell them to look it up on Charity Navigator. They have much more confidence that their dollar given to Polio Plus will be spent for that than giving a dollar to almost any other organization. So with that said, I hope you'll join me in supporting the eradication of polio. Thank you.